Imagine waking up to the sound of 50,000 people cheering not for your survival, but for the spectacle of your humiliation. You are not a criminal. You are not a warrior. You are not even considered a person anymore. You are a woman captured in war, chained beneath the Colosseum, waiting for the gates to open. And somewhere above you, gladiators sharpen their blades, not only for combat, but for something far darker the crowd has paid to see. Welcome to ancient Rome, where the arena was not just a place of death, but a stage where dignity was deliberately destroyed. By the time the sun rose over the Colosseum, the city of Rome was already awake. Vendors lined the streets, selling bread, wine, and roasted nuts. Children ran through the alleys. Senators rode past in litters carried by slaves. The empire hummed with confidence and routine. But beneath the stone floors of the amphitheater, the hypogeum, a maze of tunnels, cages, and pulleys, was thick with fear. This was where the prisoners were kept. Animals growled behind iron bars. Gladiators stretched their scarred limbs in silence. And in the darkest corner, shackled together, sat a group of women captured from a distant province the Roman legions had recently conquered. Some were noblewomen. Some were villagers. Some were barely adults. All of them had been reduced to the same thing in the eyes of Rome: props for entertainment. Many people today imagine gladiator games as brutal but straightforward. 2 fighters enter, 1 survives. But historical records, inscriptions, and Roman writings tell a far more unsettling story. The arena was theater. And like any theater, it required drama, emotion, and spectacle. That is where female prisoners came in. The Romans had a name for certain performances called damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. But this punishment was rarely as simple as throwing someone to lions. It was often staged as mythological reenactments, carefully choreographed scenes based on Roman legends. And women were frequently cast in the roles of tragic mythological victims, not because they had committed crimes, but because their suffering made the story more believable to the crowd. In one such reenactment, a woman might be forced to play the role of Dirce, a figure from Greek mythology who was tied to a wild bull and dragged to death. Historical mosaics and relief carvings show these scenes in disturbing detail. The crowd didn't see a prisoner. They saw a story come to life. They cheered for the realism. They applauded the acting. They laughed. Above all, they were entertained. The gladiators were central to this performance, but not always in the way modern people imagine. Gladiators were not just fighters. They were trained performers. Many had rehearsed routines, choreographed movements, and assigned roles in these mythological executions. Some gladiators were instructed not to kill immediately. Instead, they were told to prolong the scene, to interact with the prisoner as part of the story, to make the moment dramatic, to turn punishment into spectacle. This was not random cruelty. It was state-sponsored theater, carefully designed to remind the audience of Rome's absolute power. Because when Rome conquered a land, it didn't just take territory. It took people. And sometimes, it displayed them like trophies. For the women in the hypogeum, the waiting was worse than anything else. They could hear the crowd above them. The roar would swell and fall like waves. Sometimes they could hear the announcer's voice echoing through the stone corridors. Sometimes they could hear laughter. They did not understand Latin, but they understood tone. They knew when the crowd was excited. They knew when something terrible was about to happen. One Roman writer, Seneca, criticized these midday spectacles. He wrote that what happened during the noon games was far more disturbing than the gladiator fights in the morning. He described how prisoners were sent into the arena defenseless, how the crowd demanded more cruelty, and how mercy was considered boring. He even noted that the audience would grow impatient if the suffering ended too quickly. That tells us something chilling. The purpose was not execution. The purpose was entertainment through degradation. When the time came, guards would unlock the chains. The women would be dragged toward a wooden platform attached to a lift system. This platform would rise slowly through a trapdoor into the bright sunlight of the arena floor. Imagine going from darkness into blinding light, from silence into a thunder of screaming voices, from anonymity into being the sole focus of 50,000 eyes. The sand beneath their feet was warm from the sun and stained from earlier battles. And standing across from them, in polished armor and plumed helmets, were the gladiators. Not as rescuers, not as fellow victims, but as performers waiting for their cue. The crowd loved contrast. A strong armored man, a terrified unarmed woman. This visual alone created the emotional tension Romans craved. The announcer would describe the mythological story being reenacted. The prisoner was now no longer a person. She had been given a character name from legend, her identity erased, her role assigned. The gladiator approached not as himself, but as a mythological hero, villain, or executioner. And the crowd leaned forward in anticipation. In some cases, the woman was tied to a post or structure designed as part of the set. In others, animals were released to interact with the scene. Sometimes the gladiator's job was to control the animal as part of the drama before the final act. Everything was scripted. Everything was planned. Nothing was accidental. And that is what makes this history so unsettling. This wasn't chaos. It was organized cruelty for public enjoyment. Roman citizens believed these games served a purpose. They believed they demonstrated justice. They believed they showed the power of the empire over its enemies. They believed they honored the gods. But they also attended because they enjoyed the thrill, because the arena gave them something daily life did not: intense emotion without consequence. They could watch suffering without feeling responsible. They could cheer without guilt. Because the victims were foreigners, prisoners, or slaves people Rome had declared less than human. Back in the tunnels below, more women waited. They could hear the cheers grow louder. They could hear when the crowd reached its peak excitement. They knew that meant the performance above them was nearing its climax. Some prayed to gods Rome did not recognize. Some sat silently. Some trembled. Some had already gone numb. What is rarely discussed is that gladiators themselves were also trapped in this system. Many were slaves. Many were prisoners of war. Many had no choice in what roles they were assigned. Refusing to perform meant punishment or death. So they played their part. They followed orders. They became instruments in a machine designed to turn human lives into entertainment. And over time, this normalized behavior. What would horrify us today became routine for them. By the end of the first spectacle, the sand would be raked over, the blood absorbed, the stage reset. Because the show had to go on. There were more stories to reenact, more prisoners to display, more crowds to satisfy, and above all, more proof that Rome had the power to take a human being and turn her into a moment of amusement. As the sun climbed higher, the next platform in the hypogeum began to rise. Another woman stepped into the light. Another gladiator prepared for his role. Another story was about to be told. And the crowd roared again, hungry, eager, and completely unaware that history would one day look back at this not as glory, but as one of the darkest reflections of what entertainment can become when empathy disappears. By midday, the Colosseum had changed. The morning had belonged to disciplined combat gladiator versus gladiator, skill against skill. The crowd admired technique, bravery, and blood in equal measure. But now, as the sun stood high and shadows shrank beneath the arches, the mood shifted. This was the hour many Romans secretly preferred, the Ludi Meridiani, the noon games. This was when the arena stopped pretending to be about sport and became something far more theatrical. Below the arena floor, in the humid stone corridors of the hypogeum, a Roman official unrolled a wax tablet and read aloud instructions to a group of performers. Yes, performers. 2 gladiators. 3 animal handlers. 4 guards, and 1 condemned woman. They were not being briefed for a fight. They were being briefed for a story. The official spoke calmly, as if explaining a stage play. The woman would be presented as a mythological figure who had offended the gods. The gladiator would enter as the agent of divine punishment. At a specific cue, the animal handlers would release a trained beast to heighten the drama. The sequence of movements had been rehearsed before, with substitutes, with wooden props, with timing carefully measured. Nothing was left to chance. The arena demanded realism, and realism required choreography. Roman audiences loved mythology. They knew these stories from childhood. They could recognize the characters instantly by costume, posture, and props. So when a terrified prisoner was dressed in flowing fabric and placed on the sand, the crowd did not see a captive from Gaul, Britannia, or Judea. They saw a legendary figure. And the gladiator approaching her was no longer a slave with a sword. He was a god, a hero, or an executioner from myth. This transformation was essential because it allowed the audience to emotionally detach from reality. They were not watching cruelty. They were watching a story come to life. Some ancient mosaics and relief carvings discovered in Roman villas show scenes of women tied to structures, surrounded by animals, while armored men stand nearby as part of the composition. These images were not hidden away in shame. They decorated dining rooms. They were conversation pieces. They were memories of a great day at the games. This tells historians something deeply uncomfortable. These spectacles were not fringe events. They were culturally celebrated. The condemned woman rarely understood what was happening. She did not speak Latin. She did not know the myth being reenacted. She did not know why the crowd reacted with laughter at one moment and suspenseful silence at another. She only knew that thousands of eyes were fixed on her, and that the men surrounding her were following instructions she could not comprehend. The gladiator might circle her slowly, not to frighten her, but because the script required tension to build. The animal might be released, then held back to stretch the moment. The crowd leaned forward, hungry for the climax they knew was coming. This was pacing. This was dramatic structure. This was storytelling built on a human being's fear. Roman writers complained that during these noon spectacles, the crowd became restless if the scene ended too quickly. They wanted prolonged tension. They wanted unpredictability. They wanted emotional peaks and valleys. Seneca wrote with disgust about how people demanded more cruelty if an execution felt boring. That single word boring reveals how normalized this had become. A human life could fail to entertain. And that was considered the problem. The gladiators were trained to read the crowd. They knew when to slow down. They knew when to exaggerate a gesture. They knew how to use their bodies like actors on a stage, visible to 50,000 spectators. Many gladiators had once been soldiers. Others were criminals. Some were slaves born into the system. Over time, they learned that survival depended not only on fighting ability, but on pleasing the audience. Because a popular gladiator lived longer. And during these mythological executions, their role as performers became even more important. They were part of the illusion. Meanwhile, the Roman elite watched from shaded seats above. Senators, merchants, noblewomen, even children. For them, this was proof of Rome's order. The empire punished its enemies. The gods were honored. Justice was visible. Power was displayed publicly. But beneath those justifications was something more primitive. Fascination. Curiosity. The thrill of watching the forbiddens without consequence. Between spectacles, workers rushed into the arena with rakes and fresh sand. Bloodstains were covered. Props were reset. The next scene was prepared like a stage crew, changing sets between acts. And in the tunnels below, the next prisoner was being dressed, not in her own clothes, but in costume. A thin robe. A symbolic prop. Sometimes paint or markings to resemble the mythological character she was forced to portray. Her identity erased again. She was no longer a person. She was a role. Some historical accounts mention that certain executions reenacted stories of betrayal, punishment, or divine revenge. These themes resonated deeply with Roman values. They reinforced moral lessons the crowd believed in. The message was clear: defy Rome, defy the gods, this is your fate. And when the victim was a foreign woman, the symbolism became even more powerful. She represented conquered lands, defeated cultures, subjugated peoples. Her suffering was political theater. What makes this history especially disturbing is how organized it was. This was not a mob losing control. This was a government-approved program. Officials planned it. Workers built mechanisms for it. Trainers rehearsed it. Artists recorded it. Citizens applauded it. It was a system. A machine that turned punishment into performance. As the afternoon heat intensified, the crowd grew louder, more restless, more demanding. Wine flowed freely. Vendors shouted. The noise became constant, like a living creature breathing around the arena. The next lift began to rise. Another woman stepped into the blinding light. She shielded her eyes. The sand burned her bare feet. Across the arena, a gladiator lifted his helmet slightly to see her clearly. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Two prisoners in different roles, both trapped, both unable to escape the script written for them. The announcer's voice echoed across the stone. He described the myth. The crowd responded with cheers of recognition. They knew how this story ended. They had seen it before, and they were eager to see it again. Because repetition did not dull the experience, it intensified it. Like watching a favorite scene from a play. What we understand now, through archaeology and ancient writings, is that these noon spectacles were designed to be emotionally intense in a way gladiator fights were not. Gladiator combat had rules. Skill mattered. Outcomes were uncertain. But these mythological executions were controlled narratives. They guaranteed shock. They guaranteed drama. They guaranteed the crowd would leave talking about what they had seen. As the scene unfolded, the gladiator followed his rehearsed movements. The animal handlers did their part. The guards stood ready. Every motion had purpose. And when the final moment came, the crowd erupted in applause, not silence. Applause, as if they had witnessed a brilliant performance. Back below the arena, the remaining prisoners heard the roar and understood what it meant. Another story had ended. Another life had been used to entertain, and the show was still far from over. By late afternoon, the sand had been raked so many times it was no longer golden, but dark and heavy. The workers were exhausted. The gladiators were sweating beneath their armor. The crowd, however, was still energized, because this was what they had come for. Not just battle, but spectacle. Not just death, but degradation turned into theater. And as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the Colosseum, the final scenes of the day were prepared. The biggest crowd reactions were saved for last. The most dramatic stories. The most unforgettable performances. Because Rome understood something chilling about human nature, people remember what shocks them, and the empire wanted to be remembered. As the sun dipped behind the high stone arches of the Colosseum, the light in the arena turned amber. Long shadows stretched across the sand, and for a brief moment, the noise of the crowd softened into a low, satisfied murmur. They had been entertained. They had witnessed bravery, blood, drama, and spectacle. They would go home with stories to tell over dinner stories of the gladiator who fought like a lion, the animal that refused to obey, the scene so intense that the entire stadium held its breath. But what they would not talk about was the tunnel beneath their feet. They would not talk about the women who had waited in chains. They would not talk about the way those scenes had been planned like theater. Because for them, the day had been a success. For the empire, it had been a demonstration of power. For the prisoners, it had been the end of everything. As the crowd began to leave, workers flooded the arena floor. They gathered broken props, dragged away debris, and covered the sand one final time. The great wooden lifts were lowered back into the hypogeum. Torches were lit in the corridors below. The spectacle was over, but the system remained. Tomorrow, there would be more games, more prisoners, more stories. In the dim tunnels, gladiators removed their helmets in silence. Sweat ran down their faces, carving lines through dust and dried sand. Some sat against the stone walls, staring into nothing. Others cleaned their weapons mechanically. They had played their parts well. They had survived another day. But survival came with a cost few of them could speak about. Because no matter how much they told themselves it was just performance, they knew the fear in the prisoners' eyes had been real, and that memory did not fade easily. What history often forgets is that many gladiators were also prisoners of war, slaves, or men forced into this life. They had learned to detach emotionally, to endure what they were ordered to do. The arena trained them to suppress empathy, to see people as roles, to think in terms of cues, movements, timing, the same way actors think about a script. But unlike actors, their stage was built on real suffering. Above, Rome celebrated its greatness. The games were funded by wealthy politicians seeking popularity. The emperor himself sometimes attended, using the spectacles to remind citizens of his generosity and power. Bread was distributed. Entertainment was free. The people were satisfied. This was social control disguised as celebration. The Roman poet Juvenal later summarized it with two words: bread and circuses. Give the people food, give them spectacle, and they will not question what lies beneath. The use of female prisoners in these mythological executions served a deeper psychological purpose. It reinforced Rome's belief that conquered people were inferior, that enemies of the empire deserved humiliation. That suffering could be justified if it served a moral or political narrative. And when those victims were women, the emotional impact on the crowd was even greater. It was not random cruelty. It was symbolic, a visual message. Rome owns not only your land, but your body, your dignity, and your story. Over time, these spectacles became so normalized that artists began depicting them casually. Wealthy Romans commissioned mosaics showing scenes from the arena. Children grew up hearing stories about famous games. Travelers wrote about the Colosseum as one of the wonders of the world. Very few stopped to question what it meant. Because when cruelty becomes tradition, it stops looking like cruelty. It starts looking like culture. But not everyone approved. A few Roman philosophers and writers quietly criticized the games. They wrote about how repeated exposure to violence hardened the heart, how watching suffering as entertainment damaged the soul, how crowds demanded more and more extreme spectacles to feel the same excitement. They understood something modern psychology confirms. When empathy disappears, people become capable of applauding things they would once have feared. As centuries passed, the Roman Empire changed. Christianity spread. Public attitudes toward the games slowly shifted. By the 5th century, gladiator games had faded, and the Colosseum fell into disrepair. Grass grew where sand once absorbed blood. Silence replaced the roar of 50,000 voices. The hypogeum, once filled with prisoners and performers, became empty stone corridors visited only by wind and shadows. But the memory of what happened there never truly disappeared. Today, tourists walk through the Colosseum taking photos. They admire the architecture. They marvel at Roman engineering. They imagine gladiator fights and heroic battles. Few realize that the darkest moments in that arena did not involve warriors clashing swords. They involved defenseless people turned into props for entertainment. They involved carefully scripted scenes designed to make suffering dramatic. They involved a society so desensitized that applause followed acts we would now consider unthinkable. And that is what makes this history so powerful and so unsettling, because it forces us to ask a difficult question. How did an advanced, intelligent civilization convince itself that this was acceptable? The answer is not simple, but it begins with dehumanization. When a group of people is labeled as other, as enemies, as less worthy, it becomes easier to turn their pain into spectacle. It becomes easier to watch without feeling. It becomes easier to cheer. The gladiators were not monsters. The crowd was not uniquely evil. They were people shaped by a culture that normalized cruelty in the name of entertainment, justice, and tradition. And that is the real lesson hidden beneath the ruins of the Colosseum. Not that Romans were savage, but that ordinary humans in the right system can learn to accept almost anything. As night fell over Rome after the games, lamps flickered in windows across the city. Families ate dinner. Conversations buzzed about the day's excitement. Laughter echoed in courtyards. Life continued. Because for most Romans, what happened in the arena was simply part of life. Not a moral crisis, not a horror, just entertainment. But far beneath the arena, in the stone corridors now lit only by torches, the silence told a different story. Chains hung empty, cages stood open, and the echoes of the day's applause seemed to linger in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. History remembers the Colosseum as a symbol of Roman grandeur. But if we listen carefully, it also whispers another truth, that greatness built without empathy carries a shadow, and that shadow is written in the stories of those who had no voice, no name, and no choice. The women brought into the arena were meant to be forgotten, reduced to roles, erased from memory. But through fragments of writing, carvings, and archaeology, their existence returns, not as mythological characters, but as human beings caught in a machine of spectacle. The applause faded, the empire fell, the stones remained. And today, when we walk through those ruins, we are left with a choice the Romans never made, to remember not just the architecture, but the humanity that was lost within it.